Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. Lots is happening, and we're shooting stuff, sending stuff out, doing all sorts of things. I'll be talking to you about that in the days to come. But something I've been doing every now and then on Mr. Sci-Fi is I've been doing a history of science fiction in books, TV shows, movies, comics, novels, everything. Radio, TV, everything. So, so far we've gotten through the 60s in the history of science fiction in film, and now we enter into a really amazing period because, in my opinion, the golden age of science fiction film, the great age of science fiction film was the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I'll get into why I think that. But previously I've been going down lists of every movie released, every science fiction movie released, good, bad, and indifferent, and talking about them. But we get to the 70s, and I'm going to skip the bad ones, or at least the ones that are not memorable, because with 1968, 2001 came out. It was the top-grossing film of the year, and of course it was a great classic, a game changer. It had a huge influence on a number of writer-directors who would be making films in the 70s, and so we're going to be talking about that, because now that a big science fiction film had proven that it could be a blockbuster, it changed the way Hollywood thought about science fiction. Previously, science fiction, for the most part, was once in a blue moon, you'd get an expensive film, but everything else was kind of relegated to the B-movie side, low-budget films, you know, some of which were good, some not. But now the major studios all started to make science fiction movies, and so let's just go over some of them. We'll be covering the 70s today. And if I've left out some of your favorites, let me know. But this is just movies. We'll talk about film and TV and books elsewhere. So, and by the way, if you want to see more of my history of science fiction, definitely just type in history in the Mr. Sci-Fi thing and in the search column, and a lot of the other history of science fiction videos will pop up. So, and the whole genesis of this was when I was asked to be on James Cameron's History of Science Fiction, talking about the Twilight Zone, and then I realized that was a very director-centric history that they were doing, and I wanted to do something that would get more into some of the really interesting stuff that I knew about. So let's talk about heading into the 70s. Now, the 60s had several very, very good films. As I said, 2001 was the game changer, but another great film, of course, was Planet of the Apes, which starred Charlton Heston. Now, Charlton Heston, of course, was one of the great movie stars. He'd starred in Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments. Really, it had a history of being in great films across the board. Just an amazing man. And later he would veer into politics as the head of the National Rifle Association, but that fact will be kind of lost in history, lost in the dust of history, the minutiae of history, because he was a great, great, great actor in Touch of Evil. In many films, he really distinguished himself and was quite remarkable. Now, he'd been previously in one film by George Pal, The Naked Jungle, but that was not a science fiction film. That was about army ants, and it's a really fun film, but not science fiction. But Planet of the Apes, he was in a science fiction film, and he was great in it. Perfect. And so there were two other great science fiction films he made in the 70s, and one was based on this. This is the first edition, signed first edition, of I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Now, in the 60s, it had been made into a film called The Last Man on Earth, starring Vincent Price, a sort of an Italian film, kind of strange film. And in later decades, it would be made into I Am Legend, starring Will Smith. And if you haven't seen that film, be sure to watch the director's cut. It's a completely different film, much, much better, much closer to the book. But in the 1970s, they decided to make The Omega Man, which is, again, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. Now, one thing I should say is that in this period, and this had really started in the 20s, when they would have novels. They would have like photoplay editions where a novel would come out when the movie came out, but usually those were novels that pre-existed the movie. Whereas now, in the 70s, you would start to get not just reprints of the source material of movies like this film, but you would also get original novels written from movie scripts as something that people could buy and enjoy, and that would flesh out the story more if it was well done. And people became great fans of that form. and that's really when it got going with great. I mean, almost every movie, particularly science fiction movies, would have these tie-ins, and sometimes they were ghost-written. For instance, the Star Wars novel was actually ghost-written. It says it's written by George Lucas. It's not. It was written by Alan Dean Foster. But okay, so let's get back to The Omega Man. So this is a wonderful, wonderful film. Stars Charlton Heston as the last man on Earth, a disease. In the book, it was vampirism, but here it's more kind of like a disease that makes people light sensitive and blah, blah, blah. And that's Anthony Zerbe, and he's terrific in the movie too. Has an interracial romance between Charlton Heston and his leading lady, so Rosalind Cash. And really, really, really a fun movie, and it's just, you know, and the opening of it is great, shot in downtown LA. I think it was on Thanksgiving weekend when everything was closed down, and it's just, you know, driving around, and then he pulls out a machine gun and starts shooting at a window, and really, really, really fun. And then he made his other great science fiction movie, which was based on a novel called Make Room by Harry Harrison, and that was Soylent Green. Now, interestingly enough, they're actually now making a food called Soylent, but it's not made of, you know, if you've seen this film, you know what Soylent in this film is made out of. But this is another great Charlton Heston film, wonderful science fiction film, directed by Richard Fleischer, who directed 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, with you know, the wonderful Disney version. And interestingly enough, back in 1968, when Rod Serling was scripting Planet of the Apes, they did some tests. And they had intended for Dr. Zaius to be played by Edward G. Robinson, and the test actually had Edward G. Robinson in a test makeup as Dr. Zaius and doing a scene from Serling's early draft script. But Edward G. Robinson fell ill and couldn't do the role. It was done by Maurice Evans instead. But by the time we got Soylent Green, Edward G. Robinson was up again to being in a movie. Now, interestingly enough, this is the last film he ever appeared in. He's terrific in it. It's absolutely wonderful, and I highly, highly recommend this film. It's just great, great, great fun. It has James. It has all sorts of wonderful actors: Chuck Connors and Joseph Cotton and Brock Peters and Paula Kelly, and really, really wonderful. And again, it was later made into another film with Will Smith, but you'll be well rewarded by watching Soylent Green. Now, also another film that came out in the early 70s was Logan's Run. And Logan's Run was, here's one of the sequels that William F. Nolan wrote of Logan's Run. This is Logan's World. And it's another fun, really fun film. Now, some of these 1970 films, they seem hokey now, kind of quaint and curious. For instance, in Logan's Run, everyone wears you know, pastel colors, and they die at 30, and they're executed. And later you would see a riff on Logan's Run in, and also on Soylent Green in Cloud Atlas, which is a film I can recommend strongly. But Logan's Run was a really fun film. It was based on a novel by William F. Nolan and George Clayton Johnson. George Clayton Johnson was, of course, the great writer of The Twilight Zone. Bill Nolan was a friend of his who was part of the Charles Beaumont circle of writers that included Richard Matheson. And Logan's Run, their idea was to write, back then, you might get $3 grand for a novel if you wrote a science fiction novel. And George Clayton Johnson and William F. Nolan had an idea. They said, let's write a novel with the specific intent of selling it to the movies. And let's sell it to a non-genre publisher, a publisher who doesn't normally do science fiction. And our goal is to sell this to the movies for $100,000, which was a huge amount of money back then. And they succeeded in that goal. And Logan's Run came out. It was a big hit. It starred British actor Michael York. Jenny Agutter was in it as the female lead. She was quite wonderful. Farrah Fawcett, who was a big sensation at the time, and would around that period a little later be in Charlie's Angels, was also in it. Really a fun film. It has you know, Peter Ustinov plays an old man in it. He's a little bit an acquired taste, but still the movie is well worth watching. It's very fun. Michael York and Jenny Agutter are just utterly charming in it. And the Sandman outfit and gun and the whole notion of the Sandmen who hunt runaways who haven't turned in, you know, turned themselves in for extermination at 30. It's a great look. The film has some really fun designs, and it has a miniature city that, you know, is a model that's used as the city, the world of Logan's Run. But I can recommend it greatly. And George Clayton Johnson and Bill Nolan wrote their novel very quickly. You can listen to it on audio, and it's still in print as a novel. And very fun, very fun. It goes into many more aspects in the novel. They were actually, at one point, they were hired to write the screenplay of Logan's Run, and their draft was not used for the movie. But again, they brought a lot of creativity and a lot of joy to the writing of this book. And William F. Nolan is still with us, so if one wants to, one can go to book shows when the pandemic's over, and often he appears at these and will sign copies of Logan's Run, and he's quite a raconteur, and was very useful to me as an informational source when I wrote the Twilight Zone Companion. Now, okay, so also another subgenre of science fiction that became very popular starting in the 70s was movies made from comic books. Now, I say this because a lot of comic books, particularly in the 60s, they started to have science fiction rationales for how the heroes got their powers. And this had really started back, in 1938 with Superman. And throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, you'd seen, low-budget movie serials with Superman and Batman and so forth, and radio shows and so forth, but never a big-budget motion picture. And that changed in the 70s with Christopher Reeve's Superman, directed by Richard Donner, another great alumnus of the Twilight Zone. And Christopher Reeve was absolutely perfect. Christopher Reeves was perfect. He was incredibly handsome. He had the physique for the role. He bulked up to get in that shape. He was just charming and incredibly believable. And the movie had great heart, and it was sweet in its way. Now, coming off of the Batman TV show of the 60s, they were still kind of playing a little bit for humor. The darkness that you would see in later movies like Christopher Nolan's Batman, even Tim Burton's Batman, Superman didn't have that darkness, but it did have a great quality of earnestness and charm, and Margot Kidder was in it as Lois Lane, and Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, and it was a very entertaining film, and you really believed Christopher Reeve was a hero. He really sold it. Now, sadly, in years later, he would have a horseback riding incident and be left a quadriplegic, and then become a spokesperson for research into, curing quadriplegia. Sadly, he died before such a cure could be found, but I was going to say he was a real hero, but he was definitely an amazing actor, an amazing guy, and later we'll talk about Somewhere in Time in another video, another great Christopher Reeves role in a screenplay written by Richard Matheson. And also, a thing about this period is all these people knew each other. So it wouldn't be unusual for Richard Donner, coming off Twilight Zone, to be directing a movie that's based on a script by Richard Matheson. They all were in the same circles and were very friendly with each other. And you see that. But so Superman was a big, big, big hit. Now, Planet of the Apes, which had been a huge hit in '68, during just this one decade, the 70s, it spun off Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, Battle for the Planet of the Apes, and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. And so you see that, it was a great time for apes, one could say. And Charlton Heston reprised his role in a sort of a guest role in the sequel in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, but then you had James Franciscus, you had Victor Buono, and of course Roddy McDowall was continuing to play, the role he had originated in Planet of the Apes, and continuing with that role. And again, the films are charming. Some people see social and racial metaphors in those films. Okay. But mainly they were just kind of fun, and it was great because they had all these wonderful actors that you would see in a million TV shows, tons of movies, people like Claude Akins and, James Whitmore and so forth, and really fun. Victor Buono was a heavyset actor who was in a lot of TV shows like Wild Wild West, and so, again, seeing him in Beneath the Planet of the Apes was great fun. And now at the same time, Star Trek had been canceled in 1969, and then it started to gain huge popularity and syndication. You started to get the Star Trek conventions, and so there started to be talk very soon of a Star Trek movie, and Gene Roddenberry was rallying for that. And finally, in 1969, they released Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, this is the director's cut. Do not watch any other version of this film. Sadly, it's only in DVD right now. Hopefully, they'll come out with it in Blu-ray and 4K and so forth. But this is the version to watch. Do not watch any other version, because when it was released with a very, very tight time frame. Doug Trumbull did the VFX. It had some great stuff in it. But they cut it down for time in the theatrical release in 1979, and they cut out all the character stuff, and that's what makes the film great. The entire cast is back. Shatner, Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, George Takei, Walter Koenig, Majel Barrett, Grace Lee Whitney, everybody. And it's basically a feature-length version of an episode they did on the original Star Trek with Nomad the robot, this incredibly powerful robot who turns out to be a space probe sent from Earth and monkeyed with by powerful aliens. And so this was the basic notion of this film. So it's not the greatest notion, but visually the film has amazing things in it. And if you watch it with all the character beats restored, there's some wonderful character beats. The actors are terrific. They know their roles. The design is very very good. The costumes, the uniforms are a little curious at times. William Shatner looks like he's going off to a tennis game in what he's wearing as Captain Kirk. But that said, it's still memorable, distinctive, entertaining, and it was directed by Robert Wise. Now, Robert Wise was one of the great journeyman directors, and perhaps even a little more than that. He edited Citizen Kane, he directed Sound of Music and West Side Story, many, many hit films, Sound of Music, but also he directed Day the Earth Stood Still, which is a great science fiction film of the early 50s, and he also directed the Andromeda Strain, which we'll talk about momentarily. But because this film was so rushed into release, some of the effects were not completed as they had wanted, and Robert Wise was not happy with the theatrical release cut. So decades later, near the end of his life, they allowed him to go back and make the director's cut for the DVD. And so they improved the visual effects. They put back in the character stuff. It's a very entertaining film. It's funny because this movie, when it came out, was kind of panned, and the Star Trek fans were a little bit disappointed in it because it was a little bit, looking for God kind of thing. And but it made money. It was a financial success. And as a result, that allowed Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, to be made a few years later, with the wonderful direction of Nicholas Meyer, and that kind of really got the franchise going again. But I highly recommend the director's cut of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, at the same time, you started to get comedies and satires in science fiction as well. Now, that hadn't been done a lot previously, except maybe kind of bottom-of-the-basement kind of films like Little Shop of Horrors or embarrassments like Visit to a Small Planet, the Jerry Lewis movie. But in the 70s, you finally started to get some really good science fiction comedies, starting with Dark Star. Now, Dark Star is a delightful film. It was originally a student film made by two students at USC, one of whom stars in the film, the other whom directs it, and they co-wrote it and so forth, and they would go on to great things. One was John Carpenter, who became a terrific director with such films as The Thing and Big Trouble in Little China, and his partner was Dan O'Bannon, who stars in this. And there's a very funny in-joke, because at one point he plays Sergeant Pinback, which is a great name, but he says his real name is William Frug. William Frug, of course, was the chairman of the USC Film School at the time, and William Frug previously had been a producer on Twilight Zone in its final season. So that's a really fun in-joke that most people would not get. But this is a wonderful comedy about a crew of rather weary space travelers whose job is to go to different systems and blow up stars, blow up planets, and that's what they do. And as a talking bomb, and it's very delightful, very funny. The ending rips off a short story by two short stories by Ray Bradbury, Kaleidoscope and The Rocket Man, and but even so, it's very, very entertaining. And it was picked up for theatrical release. They had to film an extra sequence which involved Sergeant Pinback, Dan O'Bannon, trying to get their pet alien put back in its cage, and things go very awry. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But if you've never seen Dark Star, it's delightful. It's fun. Dan O'Bannon could have had a career as a comic actor. He's terrific in this. And it really shows that John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon were very talented even at the beginning of their careers. So Another comedy film that came out at the time was Sleeper, which was Woody Allen as a cryogenically frozen man who wakes up in the future and has to deal with how things have changed. Diane Keaton's in the film as well, very charming. And it's mainly using the tropes of science fiction to satirize, the world of its time. But it's, and from now on, throughout the rest of cinema and television history, and books as well, you would have science fiction writers, science fiction movies, and then you would have sort of films that were marketed and books that were marketed not in the genre, but still were utilizing the tropes of science fiction and fantasy and so forth. So, and sometimes there would be gray areas. And so, for instance, Michael Crichton, who began as a novelist, mainstream novelist with Andromeda Strain, which was about an alien disease that comes back on a space probe, he would become more and more moving into the genre thoroughly. And Andromeda Strain, as I mentioned, was directed by Robert Wise after it was a bestseller by Michael Crichton. He had studied to be a doctor, but then had decided to become a novelist instead, and was a very, very good one, and ultimately would come up with Jurassic Park. But he also was interested in trying his hand at directing, so he came up with Westworld. Now, I said there were novelizations of movies at the time. This, interestingly enough, is actually the published script with photos from the production. And this was about an amusement park that has humanoid robots who fulfill your every fantasy, and then things go awry. And it's been made more recently into a series on HBO, and which I think personally has gone awry itself. But this is a delightful film. And the fun part, and again, if you know film history, Yul Brynner plays the robot gunslinger. And in reality, he's playing a robot of the character he played, the cowboy he played, in The Magnificent Seven, which itself was a remake of Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. So there's this ripple effect through the history of cinema. So he's, in a way, satirizing himself, but he's very good in this as the robot killer. And it's a little funky. Terminator really did this trope better of someone being hunted by a machine that will not stop. But it's a delightful film, nevertheless. Richard Benjamin is in it, and Michael Crichton directed and wrote it. And he wasn't as strong as a director as he was as a writer, but the funny thing is that later he came up with Jurassic Park, and it's the same plot. It's basically people go to this wonderful, dream come true fantasy amusement park, and things go awry, and the things that are in the amusement park get out and try to kill them. So he basically, did an homage to himself, and Jurassic Park, of course, was even more of a success than Westworld. But again, if you've never seen the original Westworld, it's fun. Many of these films are not, perfect, but they're very entertaining. And so if you haven't seen them, I recommend them. There's another film that's a comedy called Death Race 2000, the original one, directed by Paul Bartel and starring Robert Carradine. I'm sorry, John Carradine? No, one of the Carradines. It's, but it stars him. And it's very, very fun. And it's well worth seeing. And it has Sylvester Stallone in it, a pre-Rocky Sylvester Stallone. So you can see him in a much more of a bit role than he would play in years to come. And so then we also have the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I only mentioned that in science fiction because it has, a science fiction elements in it, science fiction riffs. They turn out to be aliens. There's little bits and pieces of it. It's also, of course, riffing on Frankenstein. So, but it was very, very fun, very delightful. Tim Curry's spectacular in the lead. The songs are great. So if you've never seen that, and that again started to have participatory screenings where people would be quoting back the dialogue, quoting, singing the songs. Whereas science fiction fandom had always been, a two-way street in that way of people being very involved in the films. Rocky Horror Picture Show became one of those films that was its own phenomenon. Now also there was on radio at this point there was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and we'll get into that more when we talk about radio, because although it was made into a film, that was not the best version of it, to say the least. And but meantime, as we move through this decade, we have the Andromeda Strain becomes Westworld, which then is made into a sequel, Future World. So Michael Crichton's career is rippling through, and at the same time, there are certain people who had a very strong influence on science fiction at the time, but it's not noticed. It's not, and Michael Crichton is one of these people. And another one is Ira Levin. Now, Ira Levin had a big hit with both the book and the movie of Rosemary's Baby in the 60s. But he turned his mind towards science fiction in the 70s, and so he was a best-selling novelist, again, marketed as mainstream, but he wrote two books, The Boys from Brazil and The Stepford Wives, that were totally science fiction novels. The Boys from Brazil was based on the idea that Nazis in defeat, hiding in South America, would clone Hitler and try and raise, you know, a new Führer. And so it was about cloning technology, and Stepford Wives was about humanoid robots. Again, going into that Westworld notion of the fantasy, particularly the sexual fantasy of the perfect lover. And the Stepford Wives had Catherine Ross, who'd been terrific in The Graduate, and she's wonderful in this. Again, if you've never seen this version, the original version, and many of these films, by the way, were remade in later decades, not as well. So definitely check out the original of Stepford Wives. Boys from Brazil is a very entertaining film. It has Gregory Peck, who played heroes for the most part, playing Dr. Mengele, who was a very famous Nazi and an infamous Nazi doctor who performed terrible medical experiments at Auschwitz, who then went into hiding and was never found. He was never captured. And so Boys from Brazil speculates that he's in charge of this cloning experiment, and Gregory Peck is really good as Joseph Mengele. He does a very, very good job. So again, another very fun film. Now, also, in the same decade, Gregory Peck starred in yet another film that was based on a best-selling novel, which was Marooned. And in Marooned, he played an astronaut along with Gene Hackman, and they get marooned in space, and the Russians come and save them. And it was marketed as a mainstream film and as a mainstream book. The book was by Martin Caidin, who would later come up with the idea for The Bionic Man, which would be a big hit series in the 70s. So again, you have these novelists whose impact, you know, Martin Caidin, Ira Levin, and Michael Crichton, whose influence is being seen more and more in film and in television as well, which we'll talk about another time. So now that we're talking about time, we get to one of the great time travel movies of the 70s. Now, Nicholas Meyer, who later would go on to direct Wrath of Khan and also The Day After, which was a great anti-nuclear TV series, miniseries, he had a big hit novel in the 60s called The 7% Solution. And The 7% Solution was it was a Sherlock Holmes pastiche dealing with Sherlock Holmes' cocaine addiction and the idea that he would seek out help from Sigmund Freud. And they made it into a movie, and starring Nicol Williamson as Sherlock Holmes, a very wonderful version of Sherlock Holmes, and it had Alan Arkin as Sigmund Freud. Very fun movie. But this allowed Nicholas Meyer to move into film. And he wrote and directed another pastiche based on a friend's unpublished novel called Time After Time. And subsequently that novel was published. But Time After Time deals with H.G. Wells having a run-in with Jack the Ripper. And in this version, H.G. Wells has invented a real time machine. H.G. Wells, of course, was the great author of The Time Machine in 1895, and he pursues Jack the Ripper into the future, into the modern day. And it's again, charming, delightful film. It starred David Warner as Jack the Ripper, and previously, also in the 70s, Malcolm McDowell had been a sensation in A Clockwork Orange, directed by Stanley Kubrick, based on the book by Anthony Burgess. And he was incredibly malevolent in Clockwork Orange. And so in Time After Time, as a change of pace, he's the hero. He plays H.G. Wells, and he's timid, not timid, but shy, and courageous, and just you know, he's great in both movies. Now, of course, Clockwork Orange, which Stanley Kubrick directed immediately after 2001, was a huge sensation, a big hit, but also it inspired certain people, particularly in England, theoretically, to commit acts of violence, because this was about a gang that basically attacks people, innocent people, for no reason other than to enjoy ultra violence, you know. And but Malcolm McDowell was just mesmerizing in it. He had this great derby hat and one eyelash decorated, and it was very funny because when they were putting the eyelash on Malcolm McDowell, they'd only put the first one on. They were going to put both on. And Kubrick saw that just the one, he said, no, let's leave it at one, which was, of course, a great decision, because the look is still, Clockwork Orange is one of the films that doesn't really get creaky. It really is still very powerful and very effective, and really a classic. And another fun part about it is that Anthony Burgess, the novelist, at one point he had been told that he was going to die. I think it was of a brain tumor or something like that. He was going to die. He had like 6 months to live. So he started pouring these novels out as quickly as he could so that his family, his wife and kids would have something to live on when he passed. And then it turned out that he went into remission. He didn't die, and he lived for decades and became a very successful novelist. But really the only novel of his that's hugely well remembered now is Clockwork Orange. And this is this is the telling of the movie, because again, in the early 70s, you didn't have VCRs. They started to appear sort of mid-decade and later part of the 70s. And so if you wanted to if you saw a movie that you loved and you wanted to revisit it, you'd buy the novel, you'd buy, you know, the soundtrack, because you couldn't own the movie unless you collected 16mm prints, which some people did, but again, that was, you know, an expensive hobby. So but again, returning to Time After Time, it's just got a very charming quality. It satirizes the time traveler coming from the past and not knowing what plastic is, thinking it's some strange kind of wood, but it really it just really does the job. And another film, you know, we've talked about some of the tropes, you know, basically end of the world stories, you know, space exploration, alien planets, alien invasion. Now we get to computers. Now in the 70s, you started to get desktop computers. You started to get home computers. And so the power of computers, you started to have a sort of an early version of the internet. You know, most people didn't own computers yet, but you started to deal with, okay, what if computers took over the world? And so Colossus, the Forbin project, was very much about that notion of the dangers of computers basically taking over and running everything and ruling us. And again, Eric Braeden is in that film. He later was very renowned for being in soap operas, but he's very good in this, and it predates Skynet in Terminator, and again, is very entertaining. Now also during this period, you started to get some of the filmmakers, you had filmmakers who were from the golden age, like Robert Wise, and you started to get young directors who would become huge in decades to come. And one of these, of course, was Steven Spielberg. And his great science fiction film of the 70s was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and starring Richard Dreyfuss, who he had worked with in Jaws. And Close Encounters, Spielberg had a great fascination with flying saucers, and Close Encounters had design work by Ron Cobb, visual effects by Doug Trumbull. It would come off 2001. It had my friend Greg Jean built the big alien spaceship. It's a great film. I prefer the original version because it was a huge hit, and as a result of that, they let Spielberg go back in and add an extra ending. And when he did that, it just kind of wasn't as good. Richard Dreyfuss goes into the spaceship. It's kind of like being in like sort of the Alpha Centauri Holiday Inn or something, or Hilton. Not my favorite ending, but if you can, watch the original version, which I prefer. But it's a great film. Richard Dreyfuss is terrific in it, and it's very charming and just unlike any other film that had come before. So I think for now I'm going to take a break. We've talked for a half hour, and then I'll resume with part 2 in a few minutes. Bye, guys.